What is happening here?
There's nothing left to say right now about that.
In every long-running story, there are moments that quietly shape everything that comes after. Not the loud, dramatic scenes, not the headlines or the obvious turning points, but the conversations, the ones that start small and end up changing everything. On Sister Wives, these conversations have become the backbone of the story, especially as the Brown family began to shift in ways no one fully expected. Because when communication starts to break down, it doesn't happen all at once. It happens slowly. Through repeated moments where things are said, but not truly heard, where emotions are expressed, but not fully understood, and where what's left unsaid becomes just as powerful as what is spoken. For Kody Brown, these conversations have played a critical role in how his relationships have evolved. In the earlier years, discussions often felt like attempts to maintain balance, to bring everyone into alignment, to reinforce the idea of a unified family. But over time, something changed. The tone shifted. The intention behind conversations began to feel different. Less about connection, more about resolution, or sometimes control. And that shift didn't go unnoticed. For Meri Brown, conversations often carried a sense of emotional weight that lingered long after they ended. There were moments where she tried to express how she felt, about distance, about connection, about where she stood in the relationship. But instead of finding clarity, those conversations sometimes left more questions, more uncertainty, more distance. Because when communication doesn't lead to understanding, it creates a different kind of silence, one that builds over time. With Janelle Brown, the dynamic was different, but just as telling. Janelle has often approached conversations from a practical perspective, focused on solutions, on moving forward. But even in that approach, there were moments where discussions seemed to circle back to the same unresolved points, where logic met emotion and neither fully bridged the gap. And when that happens repeatedly, it changes how people engage. It shifts conversations from hopeful to cautious, from open to guarded. For Christine Brown, conversations became something else entirely, a space where she began to articulate what she needed and what she wasn't receiving. There were moments where her words carried clarity, directness, a willingness to say what had been building for years. But clarity doesn't always lead to change, and when it doesn't, it forces a deeper realization that being heard and being understood are not always the same thing. Then there's Robin Brown, whose conversations often appeared more aligned with Kody's perspective, more connected, more in sync. And that alignment created a contrast, one that fans have continued to analyze. Because when conversations flow easily in one relationship but feel strained in others, it raises questions about communication styles, about emotional connection, about where effort is being placed. But beyond individual dynamics, there's something bigger happening here. Because conversations don't just reflect relationships, they shape them. Every discussion, every disagreement, every attempt at resolution, they all contribute to the direction a relationship takes. And over time, those directions can begin to diverge. For viewers of Sister Wives, this is where things become especially powerful, because these aren't just scripted moments. They're real interactions, real emotions, real attempts to navigate complex relationships in real time. And that's what makes the conversations so impactful, because they feel real, relatable, even when the situation itself is unique. Everyone has experienced a conversation that didn't go the way they hoped, a moment where they tried to explain something important and felt like it didn't land, a discussion that ended but didn't resolve anything. And when those moments happen repeatedly, they start to define the relationship. That's exactly what we're seeing here, a series of conversations that, taken individually, might not seem like major turning points, but together they tell a story of shifting dynamics, changing priorities, and relationships that are moving in different directions. What's especially important to understand is that these conversations didn't just happen randomly. They were responses to stress, to change, to evolving expectations within the family. Because as the Brown family grew and shifted, so did the challenges they faced. And with those challenges came more difficult conversations, more complex emotions, more situations where there wasn't a clear right answer. And when there's no clear answer, communication becomes even more important, but it also becomes more difficult. Because people aren't just sharing facts, they're sharing feelings, and feelings don't always align. They don't always make sense to the other person. They don't always lead to agreement. And that's where the intensity comes in, because intense conversations aren't just about what's being said, they're about what's at stake. And in this case, what's at stake is everything: connection, trust, the future of relationships, the structure of the family itself. As we move into the next part, we'll take a closer look at specific conversations that fans believe changed everything, moments where the tone, the words, and the reactions revealed something deeper than what was happening on the surface. Because sometimes one conversation doesn't just reflect a problem, it reveals the beginning of a major shift. When fans look back at Sister Wives, it's clear that not all conversations carry the same weight. Some pass by quietly, others linger, and then are the ones that shift everything, even if at the time they didn't seem like major turning points. These are the conversations that fans are now revisiting, the ones that feel different with hindsight, the ones where the tone, the pauses, and even the silence say more than the words themselves. For Kody Brown, these moments often revolve around conflict, not just disagreement, but how that disagreement is handled, because conflict isn't unusual, but the way it's managed can define the outcome of a relationship. One of the most noticeable patterns in these conversations is how quickly they can shift. What starts as a discussion can turn into defensiveness. What begins as an attempt to connect can end with emotional distance. And that shift doesn't always happen through dramatic words. Sometimes it's in the tone, the body language, the way someone stops engaging. For Christine Brown, there were several conversations that fans now see as defining moments, times where she clearly expressed her needs, her frustrations, her desire for a deeper emotional connection. And in those moments, there was clarity, a sense that she was trying to move the relationship forward. But what stands out now is not just what she said, it's how those words were received, or in some cases, not fully received. Because when someone speaks with that level of honesty, the response matters. It can either open the door to understanding or quietly close it. With Janelle Brown, the conversations took on a different tone, less emotional on the surface, more focused on practical concerns, logistics, decisions that affect the family as a whole. But even within that approach, there were moments where the underlying tension became clear, where the conversation wasn't just about the topic at hand, but about something deeper, a difference in perspective, a gap in priorities. And those moments often ended without full resolution. Not explosive, but incomplete. And over time, incomplete conversations can be just as impactful as unresolved conflict. For Meri Brown, the conversations often carried a sense of emotional vulnerability. There were moments where she tried to articulate how she felt about the distance in her relationship, where she stood, what she needed. But what makes these conversations stand out now is the lack of closure. They didn't always lead to clear outcomes. They didn't always move the relationship forward. Instead, they seemed to hover in uncertainty. And that kind of uncertainty can be difficult to navigate, because without clarity, it's hard to know what changes, or if anything changes at all. Then there's Robin Brown, whose conversations with Kody often appeared more aligned, more fluid, less strained. And that contrast is something fans continue to focus on, because when communication feels easier in one relationship, it naturally highlights the challenges in others. It raises questions about connection, about understanding, about where emotional energy is being directed. But beyond individual conversations, there's something else that stands out: repetition. The same types of conversations happening over and over again, the same issues being discussed, sometimes from different angles, but with similar outcomes. And that repetition is what gives these moments their significance, because it suggests that the problem isn't just the conversation itself, it's the pattern behind it. For viewers of Sister Wives, this is where everything starts to connect, because when you see the same dynamic play out across multiple conversations, it becomes more than just a moment. It becomes a signal, a sign that something deeper is happening beneath the surface. Another important aspect of these conversations is timing. Many of them happen during periods of stress, change, uncertainty within the family, and those conditions can amplify everything. Emotions feel stronger, reactions become sharper, patience becomes limited, and in that environment, even small misunderstandings can grow into larger issues. But what's most revealing is not just what happens during the conversation, it's what happens after. Does anything change? Does the relationship move forward? Or does it stay in the same place? For many of these moments, the answer seems to be the same. Things don't fully resolve. And that lack of resolution becomes part of the story, part of the pattern that fans are now recognizing. Because unresolved conversations don't just disappear, they linger. They influence future interactions, they shape expectations, and over time, they contribute to bigger decisions. Decisions that from the outside may seem sudden, but are actually the result of many conversations that came before. As we move into the next part, we'll explore how these repeated conversations began to create emotional distance within the relationships, and why that distance became one of the most defining aspects of the Brown family's journey. Because sometimes, the most important part of a conversation is what it leaves behind.
As viewers continue revisiting Sister Wives,
one realization stands out more than ever. Not all conversations bring people closer. Some do the opposite. They create distance. And in the case of Kody Brown and his relationships, that distance didn't happen suddenly. It was built, conversation by conversation. Because when discussions repeatedly end without understanding, something begins to change. At first, it's subtle, a slight hesitation before speaking, a moment of holding back instead of opening up. But over time, those small shifts grow into something much bigger. For Christine Brown, this emotional distance became increasingly visible. There were conversations where she clearly expressed her needs, wanting more connection, more presence, more partnership. And while those words were heard, fans began to notice that they weren't always fully received, because hearing someone isn't the same as understanding them. And when that gap continues, it creates frustration, a feeling of being seen, but not truly understood. Over time, that feeling can change how someone approaches future conversations. Instead of speaking freely, they begin to protect themselves. They choose their words more carefully, or sometimes they stop trying altogether. With Janelle Brown, the distance looked different, but it was still there. Janelle's communication style has always been more practical, more grounded. But even within that approach, repeated conversations that didn't lead to clear outcomes began to have an effect. Instead of pushing for deeper discussion, there were moments where she seemed to step back, to disengage slightly, not out of indifference, but out of recognition that the conversation might not lead where she hoped. And that kind of quiet disengagement can be just as powerful as open conflict, because it signals a shift, a change in expectation, a realization that the effort being put in may not lead to the desired result. For Meri Brown, emotional distance had already been part of the relationship for some time, but the ongoing pattern of conversations added to that distance. There were moments of vulnerability, times where she tried to express how she felt, where she stood, what she wanted. But when those moments didn't lead to clarity or reconnection, they reinforced the existing gap. And over time, that gap became part of the relationship itself, something that was no longer surprising, but still deeply significant. Then there's Robin Brown, whose conversations with Kody often appeared more connected, more aligned, and that alignment created a noticeable contrast. Because when one relationship feels emotionally close while others feel distant, it highlights the difference even more. It makes the distance in other relationships more visible, more defined. And for viewers, that contrast has become a key part of the story. But beyond individual relationships, there's a broader dynamic at play. Because emotional distance doesn't just affect one conversation, it changes all future conversations. When people feel unheard, they start to anticipate that outcome. They enter discussions with lower expectations, less openness, more caution. And that shift in mindset changes everything. Conversations become shorter, less detailed, less emotionally invested. And when that happens repeatedly, the connection begins to fade. Not through one dramatic moment, but through gradual change. For Kody Brown, this creates a complex situation, because the more distance that develops, the harder it becomes to close that gap. Conversations that could once bring clarity now feel heavier, more difficult, more likely to lead to the same unresolved outcomes. And that can lead to a cycle, where distance leads to less communication, and less communication leads to more distance. For fans of Sister Wives, this is one of the most important patterns to recognize, because it explains how relationships can change without a single defining moment, how people can grow apart even while still trying to communicate, and how conversations, meant to bring people closer, can sometimes do the opposite. What makes this especially powerful is how relatable it is, because this isn't just about one family. It's about something many people experience in their own lives, trying to communicate, trying to be understood, and facing moments where that understanding doesn't fully happen. And when those moments repeat, they shape the relationship, they influence decisions, they create turning points. As we move into the next part, we'll explore how this emotional distance eventually led to some of the most intense and defining confrontations in the family, moments where everything that had been building beneath the surface finally came into the open. Because when distance grows for long enough, it doesn't stay quiet forever. By the time emotional distance had taken hold across multiple relationships on sister wives, it was only a matter of time before things reached a breaking point. Because distance doesn't stay quiet forever. Eventually, it turns into confrontation. And when it does, those conversations become some of the most intense and revealing moments in the entire story. For Kody Brown, these confrontations marked a clear shift in how communication played out. Earlier conversations may have been tense, but they often carried an underlying hope for resolution. Now that tone began to change. Conversations felt heavier, more direct, less about finding common ground, and more about expressing frustration that had been building for years. And when frustration builds over time, it doesn't come out quietly. It comes out all at once. For Christine Brown, these moments were some of the most defining in her journey. There were conversations where everything she had been holding in finally came to the surface, clear, honest, and unfiltered. She spoke about what she needed, what she had been missing, what she could no longer accept. And what made these moments so powerful wasn't just what she said, it was the certainty behind it. This wasn't confusion. This wasn't hesitation. It was clarity. The kind of clarity that only comes after repeated attempts to communicate have led to the same outcome. And when someone reaches that point, the conversation changes. It's no longer about trying to fix something. It's about acknowledging that it may not be fixable. With Janelle Brown, the confrontations had a different energy, but they were just as significant. Janelle's approach remained grounded, but there were moments where the underlying tension became impossible to ignore. Conversations that may have once stayed calm began to carry more weight, more directness, a sense that certain issues could no longer be avoided. And what stood out in these moments was not just the disagreement, but the realization behind it. A recognition that the dynamic had changed, that the relationship was no longer operating the way it once had. For Meri Brown, confrontation didn't always come in the form of raised voices or dramatic exchanges. Sometimes it was quieter, more internal, but no less powerful. There were moments where the reality of her situation became undeniable, where the distance in her relationship was no longer something that could be explained away or ignored. And those realizations often came through conversations that didn't necessarily resolve anything, but made the truth clearer. Then there's Robin Brown, whose role in these intense moments often appeared different. In many cases, her conversations with Kody maintained a level of alignment that contrasted with the tension seen elsewhere. But that contrast became part of the confrontation itself. Because when one relationship feels emotionally close while others feel distant, it naturally becomes part of the discussion, part of the questions being asked, part of the emotions being expressed. And that added another layer to these intense moments. What makes these confrontations so significant is not just their intensity, but their timing. They didn't happen at the beginning. They happened after years of conversations that didn't fully resolve, after patterns had already formed, after emotional distance had already taken hold, which means these weren't just reactions to a single issue. They were the result of everything that had been building over time. And that's why they feel so powerful, because they represent a shift, a point where things move from unspoken tension to spoken truth, from trying to maintain the status quo to acknowledging that something has fundamentally changed. For viewers of Sister Wives, these moments are some of the most memorable, not because they're dramatic, but because they're real. They reflect what happens when communication reaches a limit, when people can no longer ignore what they're feeling, when the need for honesty becomes stronger than the desire to keep things as they are. But what's even more important is what happens after these confrontations. Because once everything is said, once the truth is out, there's no going back to how things were. The dynamic changes, the expectations shift, and the path forward becomes something new. As we move into the next part, we'll explore how this emotional distance eventually led to some of the most intense and defining confrontations in the family, moments where everything that had been building beneath the surface finally came into the open. Because when distance grows for long enough, it doesn't stay quiet forever.
After the intense confrontations that unfolded on Sister Wives, something shifted in a way that could no longer be ignored. The conversations stopped being just conversations. They started becoming decisions. Because once everything is said, once emotions are fully expressed and truths are brought to the surface, there comes a moment where words are no longer enough. Something has to change. And for Kody Brown and his relationships, that moment arrived in very different ways for each wife. For Christine Brown, the shift from conversation to decision was clear and powerful. After years of expressing her needs, trying to communicate, and facing repeated moments where those needs weren't fully met, the realization became unavoidable. There was nothing left to explain, nothing left to clarify, because she had already said it all. And when someone reaches that point, the decision often becomes simple, even if it's not easy. Christine's choice to move forward with her own life wasn't impulsive. It wasn't based on one argument or one disagreement. It was built on a long series of conversations that led to the same emotional conclusion, that what she needed and what she was receiving were no longer aligned. And when that gap becomes too wide, the only real option is change. With Janelle Brown, the transition from conversation to decision was more subtle, but just as meaningful. Janelle didn't approach things with the same emotional intensity. Her decisions came from observation, from recognizing patterns, from understanding, over time, that certain conversations were no longer leading to progress. And instead of forcing a resolution, she began to shift her focus toward independence, toward creating a life that didn't rely on constant alignment with a system that no longer felt stable. Her decision wasn't about one defining moment. It was about a gradual realization that her path needed to change. For Meri Brown, the connection between conversations and decisions took on a different form. Her journey wasn't marked by a single turning point, but by a slow evolution, a series of moments where conversations highlighted the distance in her relationship, where attempts at reconnection didn't lead to lasting change. And over time, those moments shaped her understanding of the situation, not necessarily pushing her toward one immediate decision, but guiding her toward a different perspective, one where her identity, her happiness, and her future weren't entirely tied to the relationship. And that shift, while quieter, is just as significant. Then there's Robin Brown, whose experience within this phase of the story appears more stable. Her conversations with Kody often resulted in alignment rather than conflict, and because of that, the transition from conversation to decision didn't carry the same tension. But that difference became part of the overall dynamic, because while some relationships were moving towards separation or independence, hers remained consistent, and that contrast made the decisions of the others even more noticeable. What's important to understand is that these decisions didn't come from nowhere. They were the natural outcome of repeated conversations, repeated patterns, repeated experiences that led to a deeper understanding of what was and wasn't working. For viewers of Sister Wives, this is where everything starts to make sense. Because when you look at the decisions on their own, they can seem sudden, unexpected, even shocking. But when you trace them back through the conversations that came before, they feel inevitable. They feel like the only logical conclusion to a story that had been building for years. Another key element in this transition is emotional clarity, because decisions like these don't just happen because of external circumstances. They happen because something changes internally, a shift in how someone sees their situation, a realization of what they truly need, and an understanding that continuing the same path will not lead to a different outcome. That kind of clarity is powerful, because once it's reached, it's very difficult to ignore. For Kody Brown, this phase represents a major turning point as well, because the decisions made by the wives don't just affect them individually, they reshape the entire structure of the family. They change the dynamics, the expectations, the future. And that means that the impact of these conversations goes far beyond the moment they happen. They influence everything that comes next. As we move into the next part, we'll explore how these decisions didn't just change individual relationships, they transformed the entire family dynamic, creating a new reality that looks very different from what viewers once knew. Because when decisions like these are made, nothing stays the same. After the decisions that followed those intense conversations on Sister Wives, the Brown family was no longer operating under the same structure it once had. And that realization marked one of the biggest turning points in the entire story. Because this wasn't just about individual relationships changing, it was about the entire family being redefined. For Kody Brown, the shift was impossible to ignore. The role he once held, as the center of a large interconnected family, began to look very different. Where there was once a shared vision of unity, there were now separate paths, separate priorities, separate futures. And that changes everything, because a structure built on connection can't function the same way when that connection begins to break apart. For Christine Brown, the redefinition of the family meant stepping fully into a new chapter, one where her identity was no longer tied to the system she had been part of for so long. Her decision didn't just change her relationship with Kody, it changed her relationship with the entire family dynamic. She moved from being part of a shared structure to building something independent. And that shift represents more than just physical separation. It represents emotional freedom, the ability to create a life that aligns with her own needs and values. With Janelle Brown, the redefinition looked different, but it was just as impactful. Janelle didn't necessarily separate in the same visible way, but her focus shifted, away from maintaining the original structure and toward creating her own path within or even outside of it. Her independence became more pronounced, her decisions more self-directed,
And that independence contributed to the overall transformation of the family. For Meri Brown, the redefinition was more internal. Her journey wasn't centered on a single decision, but on a gradual shift in identity, in perspective, in how she saw her place within the family. The conversations, the distance, the lack of resolution, all of it led to a deeper realization that her life could not be fully defined by a structure that was no longer functioning in the same way. And that realization opened the door to change, to growth, to a future that looked different from the past. Then there's Robin Brown, whose position within this new structure appears more stable. Her relationship with Kody remained consistent, and as a result, their dynamic became the central piece of what was left of the original system. But even that stability exists within a changed context, because it's no longer part of a balanced multi-relationship dynamic. It's part of a family that has evolved into something new, something more concentrated, more focused. And that shift affects how everything is perceived. What makes this phase so significant is that it highlights a fundamental truth. Families are not fixed. They evolve, they adapt, and sometimes they transform into something completely different from what they once were. For viewers of Sister Wives, this transformation has been both surprising and revealing, because the original idea of the Brown family was built on unity, on shared experiences, on the belief that multiple relationships could function together as one. But over time, that idea was tested, challenged, and ultimately reshaped. And now what remains is not the same structure, but a collection of individual paths connected by history. And that's what makes this moment so powerful, because it's not just about what changed, it's about what those changes represent. Growth, realization, the understanding that sometimes the only way forward is to move in a different direction. For Kody Brown, this means navigating a reality that looks very different from the one he once envisioned. For the wives, it means defining their futures on their own terms. And for the audience, it means witnessing a story that has evolved far beyond its original premise. As we move into the next part, we'll explore how these redefined family dynamic has impacted the way fans see the entire story, and why these changes have sparked more conversation than ever before. Because when something changes this much, people don't just notice, they react. As the Brown family's dynamic continued to evolve on Sister Wives, something else began to grow just as rapidly: the emotional reaction from fans. Because what viewers were watching wasn't just a reality show anymore. It felt like something deeper, more personal, more real. And that's why these intense conversations and the decisions that followed have hit so hard. For many viewers, the journey of Kody Brown and his relationships has been something they've followed for years. They've seen the beginning, the hope, the idea of a family built on unity and shared values. And when you invest that much time into a story, it stops being just entertainment. It becomes something you care about, something you form opinions on, something you feel connected to. So when those conversations started to change, when the tone shifted, when the outcomes became more serious, fans felt it. Not just as observers, but almost as participants, because they've been part of the journey for so long. One of the biggest reasons these moments feel so intense is because they reflect real-life experiences. Even though the structure of the Brown family is unique, the emotions involved are not. Feeling unheard, trying to communicate something important, facing repeated misunderstandings. These are things many people have experienced in their own relationships. And when viewers see those emotions play out on Sister Wives, it creates a strong connection because it feels familiar, relatable, authentic. For Christine Brown, her moments of clarity and decision resonated deeply with fans. Many viewers saw her journey as one of empowerment, of finally reaching a point where she chose herself. And that kind of story naturally creates a strong emotional response, because it reflects something many people aspire to: the courage to make difficult decisions when something no longer feels right. With Janelle Brown, the reaction was different, but still powerful. Her quiet independence, her steady shift toward focusing on her own path, it resonated with viewers who value strength that doesn't need to be loud, who understand that not all major changes come with dramatic moments. Sometimes they come with quiet decisions that carry just as much impact. For Meri Brown, the emotional response from fans has been more complex. Her journey has been filled with uncertainty, distance, and gradual transformation. And because of that, viewers have experienced a range of emotions: empathy, curiosity, even frustration at times. But above all, there's been a continued interest in her story because it reflects a different kind of growth, one that isn't defined by a single decision, but by a long process of change. Then there's Robin Brown, whose role in the narrative often sparks strong reactions, not necessarily because of individual moments, but because of how her relationship contrasts with the others. That contrast has become a focal point for fans, a way to understand the larger dynamic, and that naturally leads to discussion, debate, different interpretations. What makes all of this even more intense is the way fans engage with the show today. They don't just watch, they analyze, they discuss. They revisit past episodes and connect them to what's happening now. And in doing so, they create a deeper understanding of the story, one that goes beyond what's shown on screen. Social media has amplified this experience. Conversations that might have once been private are now shared across platforms. Fans compare perspectives, point out patterns, highlight moments that others may have missed. And that collective analysis adds another layer to the viewing experience. It turns individual reactions into a shared narrative, a conversation that continues long after the episode ends. For Kody Brown, this level of attention means that every conversation is now viewed through a more critical lens. Every word, every reaction, every decision, all of it becomes part of the larger story fans are trying to understand. And once that level of engagement is reached, it doesn't fade easily, because people are invested. They want to know what happens next. They want to understand why things happened the way they did. And most importantly, they want to see how it all unfolds. As we move into the next part, we'll explore how these intense conversations have completely changed the direction of the show itself, and why the future of Sister Wives may look very different from what fans once expected. Because when the audience becomes this engaged, the story takes on a life of its own. As the intense conversations continued to unfold on Sister Wives, something bigger started to happen, something that went beyond individual relationships or even the Brown family itself. The show began to change, because when the foundation of a story shifts, everything built on top of it shifts too. And in this case, the foundation was always the idea of a unified plural family, a system built on balance, shared responsibility, multiple relationships working together as one. But as those conversations revealed deeper issues, emotional distance, unresolved conflict, shifting priorities, that foundation began to crack. And once that happens, the story can't continue in the same way. For Kody Brown, this meant that his role within the show had to evolve. He was no longer just the center of a large functioning family dynamic. He became part of a much more complex narrative, one that focused on change, conflict, and the consequences of long-term patterns. And that shift changed how viewers saw him, not just as a figure within the family, but as a central piece of a much larger story about relationships in transformation. For Christine Brown, the change in the show created space for a different kind of storyline, one focused on independence, on life after separation, on what it looks like to step away from a long-established structure and build something new. Her journey became one of the most compelling parts of the show, not because it followed the original premise, but because it challenged it. It showed that the story wasn't fixed, that it could evolve in unexpected ways. With Janelle Brown, the shift in the show highlighted a quieter kind of transformation. Her storyline moved away from maintaining the family structure and toward defining her own path, and that added a new layer to the narrative, because it showed that change doesn't always look dramatic. Sometimes it's steady, intentional, built over time. For Meri Brown, the evolving nature of the show brought more focus to her internal journey, her growth, her self-discovery, her gradual movement toward independence. And while her path didn't follow a single dramatic turning point, it added depth to the overall story, because it reflected a different kind of change, one that happened slowly but meaningfully. Then there's Robin Brown, whose role in the show also shifted as the family dynamic changed. As other relationships moved in different directions, her connection with Kody became more central to what remained of the original structure. And that naturally changed how the show was framed, because instead of multiple balanced relationships, the focus became more concentrated, more specific, more centered on fewer dynamics. What makes this transformation so significant is how it changes the viewing experience. In the beginning, Sister Wives was about exploring a unique family structure, understanding how it worked, seeing how multiple relationships could coexist within one system. But now, the show has become something else entirely. It's about evolution, about what happens when that system is tested over time, about how people respond when the original idea no longer fits their reality. And that shift has made the show feel more real, more grounded, more reflective of real-life experiences. Because life doesn't stay the same. Relationships change, people grow, situations evolve, and sometimes the story you started with isn't the story you end up telling. For fans,
This has created a new kind of engagement. They're not just watching to see how the family functions anymore. They're watching to see how it transforms, what decisions are made, what paths are chosen, what the future looks like for each individual. And that creates a different kind of anticipation, because the outcome is no longer predictable. The story is still unfolding, still evolving, still being shaped by the conversations and decisions that happen along the way. As we move into the next part, we'll explore how this transformation has influenced the way fans interpret everything they've seen, and why the meaning of past moments has completely changed. Because when a story evolves this much, it changes not just the future, but the past as well.
As the story of Sister Wives continues to evolve, one of the most fascinating shifts isn't just about what's happening now. It's about how everything from the past is being reinterpreted. Because once viewers understand the patterns behind the intense conversations, they don't just watch new episodes differently. They start seeing old ones in a completely new light. Moments that once felt small now feel significant. Conversations that seemed ordinary now feel like early warning signs. And interactions that didn't stand out before now feel like key pieces of a much bigger story. For Kody Brown, this shift in perception has been especially noticeable. Fans are revisiting earlier seasons and noticing details they didn't pick up on the first time. The way he responded during difficult conversations, the tone he used when addressing concerns, the subtle shifts in how he communicated with each wife. And when those details are viewed with the knowledge of what happens later, they take on a completely different meaning. Because hindsight changes everything. For Christine Brown, many of her earlier conversations now feel like the beginning of a journey that fans didn't fully understand at the time. Moments where she expressed dissatisfaction or emotional need now feel more significant. Not because they were louder or more dramatic, but because they were consistent. They showed a pattern that would eventually lead to one of the biggest decisions in the family's history. And now those moments feel like pieces of a puzzle that has finally come together. With Janelle Brown, the reinterpretation is more subtle, but still powerful. Her calm, practical approach to conversations once seemed like stability, a steady presence within the family. But now fans are seeing those same moments differently. They're noticing the distance, the restraint, the way certain conversations didn't go deeper, even when they could have. And that adds a new layer to her story. Because it suggests that her independence wasn't something that appeared suddenly, it was something that had been developing quietly over time. For Meri Brown, the past feels even more complex. Her conversations have always carried emotional weight, but now they feel more revealing. Moments of vulnerability, moments of uncertainty, moments where the lack of resolution becomes more noticeable in hindsight. And when those moments are viewed together, they paint a clearer picture of her journey. One that was shaped not by a single turning point, but by a series of experiences that gradually defined her path. Then there's Robin Brown, whose conversations are also being re-examined. Fans are paying closer attention to how her conversations with Kody differed from the others, how alignment and understanding seemed more consistent. And that contrast, when viewed through the lens of what the family has become, feels more significant than it did before. Because now it's not just a difference, it's part of a pattern. What makes this shift so powerful is that it changes the meaning of the entire story. It turns isolated moments into connected ones. It transforms random interactions into meaningful patterns, and it allows fans to see the journey not just as it unfolded, but as it was building all along. For viewers of Sister Wives, this creates a deeper level of engagement, because the show is no longer just something to watch. It's something to analyze, to revisit, to understand on a more complete level. And that's why the conversation around it continues to grow, because every new realization leads to another question, another discussion, another layer of interpretation. What's especially interesting is how this reinterpretation brings a sense of closure to certain aspects of the story. Decisions that once felt sudden now feel logical. Changes that once seemed surprising now feel expected. And that clarity changes how fans emotionally respond to everything. Because understanding reduces confusion. It replaces uncertainty with perspective, and it allows the story to feel more complete. But at the same time, it also raises new questions, because if so much was hidden in plain sight before, what else might still be unfolding? What other patterns might still be forming? What parts of the story have yet to be fully understood? As we move into the final part, we'll bring everything together, exploring what these intense conversations ultimately reveal about the Brown family and why fans feel like they've finally uncovered something important. Because in the end, it's not just about what changed, it's about what it all means. After everything that has unfolded on Sister Wives, fans are left with one powerful realization. The biggest moments weren't the loudest ones. They were the conversations, the intense, emotional, sometimes uncomfortable discussions that slowly revealed what was really happening beneath the surface. Because in the end, those conversations told the entire story. For Kody Brown, they revealed a shift, not just in how he communicated, but in how his relationships evolved over time. Through repeated discussions, fans began to see patterns, how certain concerns were addressed, how emotions were handled, how decisions were shaped. And while no single conversation defined everything, together they created a clear direction, a path that led to major changes within the family. For Christine Brown, these conversations revealed something even more powerful: clarity. Each discussion brought her closer to understanding what she truly needed, what she could no longer accept, and what kind of future she wanted for herself. And that clarity became the foundation for one of the most defining decisions in the entire series. Her journey showed that sometimes conversations don't fix relationships, they help you understand when it's time to move on. With Janelle Brown, the conversations revealed a different kind of strength. Not loud, not dramatic, but steady and grounded. They showed how repeated experiences can lead to quiet realization, a shift in perspective that doesn't need a single defining moment to be powerful. Her story highlighted that sometimes change happens in silence, through observation, through understanding, through choosing a path that feels right, even if it looks different from what was expected. For Meri Brown, the conversations revealed complexity, a journey that didn't follow a clear or simple path. Moments of vulnerability, moments of uncertainty, moments where answers weren't immediate, but still meaningful. Her story showed that not all transformations happen quickly. Some take time, patience, and a willingness to navigate uncertainty without a clear resolution. Then there's Robin Brown, whose conversations revealed consistency, a dynamic that appeared more aligned, more connected. And that contrast played a major role in how fans interpreted the overall story. Because when one relationship functions differently from the others, it naturally becomes part of the larger narrative. It raises questions, it shapes perception, it adds another layer to the understanding of everything that has happened. But beyond individual journeys, these intense conversations reveal something bigger. They show how relationships evolve over time, how communication shapes connection, how repeated patterns influence outcomes. Because in any relationship, it's not just about what is said once, it's about what is said repeatedly, what is heard, what is understood, and what remains unresolved. For viewers of Sister Wives, this realization has changed everything. The show is no longer just about a unique family structure. It's about human dynamics, about how people communicate, how they grow, how they change, and how those changes impact the people around them. What makes this story so compelling is that it doesn't offer simple answers. It doesn't present one clear perspective. Instead, it shows a range of experiences, different reactions, different outcomes, all shaped by the same underlying patterns. And that's what makes it feel real. Because real life isn't simple. It's layered, complex, full of moments that don't always resolve the way we expect. But if there's one thing these conversations ultimately reveal, it's this: nothing changes without communication. And sometimes communication doesn't change the situation, it reveals the truth about it. For Kody Brown and the entire Brown family, those truths have reshaped everything: the relationships, the structure, the future. And for fans, they've provided something just as important: understanding. Not just of what happened, but of why it happened. Because in the end, the most intense conversations aren't the ones filled with the most emotion. They're the ones that lead to the biggest realizations. And in this story, those realizations have changed everything.